A Cricketing View, an irregular podcast about cricket and other things. Hello and welcome to a new episode of A Cricketing View podcast. Today's episode is about technology in sport and specifically technology in adjudication of on-field decisions using video review. And we're going to talk about cricket and football broadly. And my guests today are three members of a quiz team who also happen to be learned and experienced in these areas. My first guest is Daisy Christodoulou. She's the Director of Education at No More Marking. She's an expert in alternative forms of assessing high school students. And she used to be an English teacher, and now she's a distinguished educationist. My second guest is Jonathan Wilson of The Guardian and several other publications. He's the author of 11 books, most famously Inverting the Pyramid. But if you ask me for my favorite one of his books, it's Angels with Dirty Faces, which is a history of Argentinian football. And my third guest is Daniel Norcross of Test Match Special and formerly a guest on this podcast as well. Welcome all.
Hello, welcome.
Hello. It's great to be back, Carters.
Daisy, in your widely read Twitter thread on VAR, which I think you wrote during an actual VAR review in a football game, you sort of alluded to this problem of trying to find objective reality where there's actually none. Is it your sense that this is a crisis of evidence, or is it a crisis of authority?
So I think it's both. And I think one issue you've got is that you've got lots of decisions being made on the football field, which are probably genuinely, there's a lot of calls which are genuinely kind of 50-50. They're not line calls. They're probably on a distribution. So, a clear and obvious handball. What is a handball? What counts as a clear sort of goal scoring opportunity? So you've got a lot of things where you think you could ask 100 referees and maybe 60 might say one, 40 the other. So you're bringing in technology and it isn't necessarily getting you to any clarity. The other issue you've got is then when you do have binary decisions like offside. Now I thought VAR would be very good for offside because offside's a binary line call and you can say, well, he either is or isn't offside. But actually what we've seen with that is we've seen huge problems there, which have been about the tension between the letter and the spirit of the law. Now you're seeing a lot of decisions being given out that are being given not as a goal because they're offside according to a literal letter of the law definition. But they would never have been given out probably at any time in the game's history because you just wouldn't have had people be able to see the infringement of a toe or a nose that's offside. So you're getting a tension as well between the letter and the spirit of the law. So I think in a number of ways, it's bringing up all kinds of issues about authority, about evidence, about what objective decision making really is, and it's complicating these things rather than solving them.
It's interesting you say that because you could organize decisions in basically two groups, right? One is a decision which is a question of fact, and the other is a decision which is a question of opinion, of interpretation. Was that deliberate handball, or would that ball have gone on to hit leg stump, or something like that, right? And those are judgment calls, and whatever the empirical reality of that particular situation is, it is not necessary that it should cleanly fall in one or the other end of the answer. Now, Jonathan, you wrote a review of the Copa America semifinal a few months ago, where you were saying essentially that it's not just the viewers and the journalists who have these problems, deciding and agreeing about an interpretation. But you're saying that old solidarities and old agreements and conventions about something that just looks like a foul no longer seem to apply even among players and referees. Could you build on that? Because that you would think that those guys would know like when a foul is a foul, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's almost as if the law has three levels, all of which go together to make the decision. So there's the law that is written down,
right,
and that is accessible to everybody, the laws of the game, and you can go and read them on the FIFA website. There's then the guidelines to referees, which are constantly reviewed before every season, every Premier League season. A new set of guidelines to referees will be produced and it'll be distributed to the clubs. And for some reason, they're incredibly reluctant to give them to journalists, but it would be very useful to us to know, what they're asking referees to look at specifically, or how they're telling referees to interpret certain situations. And then there's the third step, which is Daisy in that Twitter thread referred to the tacit assumptions we have, which is just understanding what those laws mean, because codifying something as huge and as random and with as many variants as football is very, very difficult. See, the law says is an offence to trip or attempt to trip an opponent. But that's it. That covers an enormous variety of different situations. And over the 150 or 160 years of football's history, we've sort of worked out what we mean by that. So I think you had a really good example of the problems we now have with VAR and the way it's making us question what we thought we knew in the game between Chelsea and Manchester United, when Cesar Azpilicueta pushed Brandon Williams, and I think most people would accept that was a foul because his hands went out, he hit Williams in the back, Williams sort of collapsed. But then you see the replay and you realise, well, actually, he's only made that motion, that forward motion, and his hands have sort of gone out automatically because he himself has been nudged in the back by Fred. Now, that nudge, would he know previous iteration of football, nobody would ever consider that a foul. But what we now see is that caused Azpilicueta to commit a foul that led to a goal being disallowed. And so if that's the case, should that not then be a foul? So the decision that was given by VAR was a decision that would have been made in most cases pre-VAR. But it did make you think, well, now we see quite clearly that nudge has caused the foul. Maybe that nudge should also be considered a foul. But nudging somebody as you go up to head the ball is just what you do. That's been what we've done in football all the way, right back to 1863. So, it's that kind of issue of suddenly seeing things and being asked to reassess things that we previously sort of just turned away from and sort of accepted as being part of the game. That's what VAR's making us do, which is a sort of process is not actually a bad process to go through. The problem is it's happening during a season and not during some kind of trial period.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, John. And actually, there's an analogy there with cricket, which is that when you slow things down and put them on a 2D screen, you don't always get actually, the promise of greater accuracy. And I remember with cricket, we went through this like 20, 25 years ago with catches. That there were lots of catches that you could see that when it was in 3D, a player would say, look, my hands are underneath this ball, it's definitely not touching the ground. But when you showed the replay, it would look like it was touching the ground. And there was a whole thing, as I said, about 20 years ago with that, which is, again, just another way of where you're seeing things on a screen and you're slowing things down, and you're seeing things that haven't seen before that in the case of those catches may not even actually be true because you're shortening the image. So
I think you might have a slightly different issue there, Miney, because I think there you've got a slight failure of the technology.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Whereas where we've got with VAR more so than DRS is questioning the entire precepts of the laws or the rules of the game.
Yes.
So football fans have been, and broadcasters are massively responsible for this, but I don't blame them for it either.
Yeah.
Which is that we thrive on people furiously ringing in to phone-in programs.
Yeah.
And because most people are largely ignorant about how the game is really played at the highest level by the very best players, what they get really vexed by is the sense of injustice that their team has been thwarted in their ambition by a one-eyed or cheating or biased referee stroke umpire. And that used to bedevil cricket for years and years and years, especially before we had neutral umpires.
Yeah.
Whereas in cricket, the introduction of DRS, because our rules are written in cricket rather differently and don't really allow for interpretation, the only place that I see DRS has really screwed us up in this regard is obstructing the field. It's when you see somebody running and then do they deviate towards the stumps or not? And when you do that in slow motion, sometimes that can look like deliberate intent to thwart the throw. Whereas I think in real time, if you were just watching that, you go, well, he was just hit by the ball. But for the most part,
yeah,
I don't think cricket suffers from that in the same way that VAR has really challenged football and football fans as to what it is that they have been watching for the last 160 years, if they're lucky enough to live long.
You know, in cricket, I used to think that it was a novelty that when they reviewed a catch, for instance, they would see it from 8 or 9 different angles, right? And when they wrote the law for catches, they could not have imagined that there would be 8 or 9 sets of eyes from 8 or 9 different vantage points looking at the same action and sort of coming to one conclusion. And I thought, Jonathan, that this is something which is especially acute in football, because the laws of football are written to be interpreted by a referee who is on the pitch and is at one particular point on the pitch at that particular point in time, and he has his view of the action is from that, or her view of the action is from that standpoint, right? And referees are trained to position themselves in relation to the action, depending on how the play is developing and so on, right? But suddenly with VAR, you have the same action like Azpilicueta and Fred and I forget who the striker was. But that action is now being viewed from like 4 or 5 different angles. And sometimes you get the sense that these different angles, rather than, firstly, you're comparing the original decision which the referee made or didn't make from his standpoint with, the combined evidence of these 4 or 5 viewpoints, like these 4 or 5 pictures that you have. And what it seems to do a lot of the time is that it just seems to give everybody whatever ammunition they want to argue their case, as Daniel was saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Rashomon effect, isn't it? The more the more witnesses you have, the more different versions of reality you have. But I think that this point, I think it's a really good point that the laws were written assuming one referee who had authority, aided by assistants, and they were assistants. And so a linesman could say, look, I'm absolutely convinced he elbowed him, and the referee would go, okay, I didn't see that, but if you're convinced, I will send him off. Whereas if there was a dispute between the two, where the referee said, oh, I thought I saw this, and the linesman said, oh, I thought I saw this, we know the referee is the prime official. He's the one who has the authority. So I think the great example of that, and it's relatively recent, which I think is interesting, that after the 1990 World Cup, which was very negative, there was a series of rule changes, one of which was to offside. And so I can't remember the year, but sort of mid-90s, the offside law was changed to say that if you're level with the penultimate defender, so the goalkeeper plus one, usually, if you're level with him, then you're onside. And previously, level was off. But level is a beautifully vague term. Mm-hmm. And what it meant was a linesman looking across the line, if those two players were roughly in the same, in the same line, and actually in reality they could be sort of 6 inches apart, you said that's onside. And we understood that vaguely. We understood that the human eye cannot possibly process all that information perfectly. And it gave, to use a cricketing term, it gave the benefit of the doubt to the forward. Yeah. And that seemed to me an excellent law that we all sort of grasped. We weren't asking for millimetre by millimetre precision. VAR comes in, and suddenly level doesn't really exist because you're working on the level of pixels on a screen. But the problem is you have people being given offside by a matter of millimetres. Theoretically, you could be offside by a millimetre. Yeah. And yet, of course, technology is nowhere near good enough to prove that. So, I'm not in any sense a physicist, but pretty quickly, I realized, I think it was at the Leicester Tottenham game where I realised this. The frame rate of the cameras is 50 frames per second. So you've got a 0.02 second gap, and you see that in cricket very, very often with run-out decisions. You see that one frame is short, the next frame is over the line, and that occasionally the decision, the stumps are broken somewhere between those two points. Now, in 0.02 seconds, a player running at 25 kph, which is not uncommon at all, moves just over, I think, nearly 15 centimeters, 14 point something centimeters. Yeah. Now, if the defender is also moving in the opposite direction, in 0.02 seconds, in the gap between two frames, their relative positions could have changed by a foot.
And the other thing I'd add into
given
that,
offside by a millimetre. That makes no sense at all.
And the other thing I'd add to that is a player's foot. When you say at the moment the ball is played, the player's foot is touching the ball. Is it the moment it hits the ball, or the moment it leaves? The moment the ball leaves the boot? That in itself is not.
Well, it is actually written in the guidelines. Yeah. It's the moment it leaves the boot, but actually judging that is obviously incredibly difficult. So the way it works in practice is that in the VAR booth at Stockley Park, they are given 3 frames which are closest to the moment of the ball leaving the boot, and they choose which of those 3 they think is closest to the last contact of boot on ball, and then that is used as that's where they it's the equivalent frame, and all the other cameras are used to build the 3D image, which tells you. But in 0.02 seconds, a huge amount can happen. So that's why I think they have to build a margin of error into that and say that we just don't know to within whatever the distance is, 10 centimetres, whatever, and therefore within 10 centimetres is still onside.
Can I just say that we shouldn't have a rosy tinted glow about the notion that in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, etc., we all put up with refereeing decisions being slightly imperfect. I mean, I know Manchester United fans who are still livid about Bobby Stokes' supposed offside goal for Southampton in the 1976 Cup final. So it's not as if people, I know, especially football fans, I mean, even more so, I think, possibly than cricket fans in England, maybe not so in India, but that they still rant and rave about perceived injustice. So you can totally understand why VAR was introduced, because, I mean, it was clogging up phone-in programs and making them deeply tedious.
I totally agree.
We are very good at injustice, I can tell you. I mean...
well, I mean, there's another point there, Dan, that I sort of... It's kind of obvious, but I didn't really appreciate it till a couple of weeks ago when I was doing some research, which is that refereeing has become much more uniform since mass televisation, because we can all see everything. And so even though we're arguing all the time, and you get people on one side of the equation swearing black is white, and vice versa, but actually we're much clearer now than we've ever been before on what constitutes a foul, or on what constitutes a red card offence, for instance. Because previously referees just sort of made it up themselves. They had their own little kind of value system, but they weren't getting videos of games that they could compare themselves to. So televisation in that sense has created a greater uniformity.
I agree with that, and I think also the thing you've got to do is you want to, as you say, Dan, there are errors, and whenever you rely on one human judgment, you will have errors. The question is, how do you get to a point where you're overturning those errors but not introducing lots of other errors? How do you get to a point where you're getting more right decisions? That's one question. But the other question is, even when you're getting to a point where you're getting more right decisions, it goes back to what John was talking about earlier about the development of the offside rule. And the reason I'm fascinated by the offside rule and the LBW rule is they're just such fascinating examples of where you are creating laws to try and legislate for a kind of spirit. So in the case of LBW, you don't want batsmen to just be planting their foot and padding away the ball. That doesn't feel like the right thing. It's not good for the game. In the case of football, you don't have any offside rule. You're just getting players bombarding the keeper, goal hanging, standing up near the goal, and that's not going to lead to great football either. But it's really hard to legislate, to come up with a way of defining a law that prevents the kind of bad putting your pad forward, trying to goal hang, without eliminating the fact that obviously sometimes the ball is going to hit the pad and that's fine, and sometimes obviously a striker has to be near the goal. And the offside rule and the LBW are both attempts to legislate that. And it's no coincidence that you go back to the history of football and cricket, that there's a history of tweaking them, adjusting them, trying to get the right balance, and trying to stop people exploiting the letter of the law. And I think John is right to say, and John's done a great article about this, that by 2005, you've probably got to the perfect balance with football. You got to the point where it was just about setting up a playing area that was about maybe 60 yards wide, that allowed for skillful players to have space to pick out passes, that didn't allow defensive teams to really exploit it by attempting to step up too much, but neither did it allow attacking teams to exploit it by just goal hanging. So you had a really nice balance. And I think John's right to say that what you're getting now with VAR is destroying that balance. And we don't know what it's going to do. It's just upsetting that. And who knows if it will bed down, how it will bed down. The reason I think DRS for LBW is actually such a good thing is I think it's tweaked the balance in a good way. So it isn't that it's just led to being more right decisions. It has tweaked the balance in favour of the bowler and particularly in favour of the finger spinner. But I think that's a good thing. And I think it's one of the few innovations in cricket over the last 30 years that's been a pro-bowler change. And I think it's been necessary. So
I agree with you entirely there, Daisy. Yeah. And on that point, you know, the change, the most recent change, I think, to the LBW law was after Cowdrey basically padded away Ramadan and Valentine.
Absolutely, yeah.
And by introducing the fact that, you know, that you've got to play a shot, that has made a massive difference to how, you know, the bowler can bowl at a line.
Yeah.
It's taken away negativity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also introduced other parts. I mean, that change in the law itself, in when would it have been? I suppose about 1960 odd, helped to change the way people started to think about cricket and started to think about winning rather than about drawing, although many other things have come into that as well.
Yeah.
But DRS has meant that now umpires are actually adjudicating that correctly, because what they didn't do for years until DRS was give people out the moment they got a stride in, that if they played a straight bat, I mean, the infuriation, as every amateur cricketer will know, because it seeps all the way down the pyramid, was that if you played a cross-batted shot with a massive stride in and you were hit bang in front, you were given out. If you were playing a forward defensive shot, playing to exactly the same ball, you were given not out.
Yep.
Well, DRS changed that, so it's made umpires actually think about the trajectory of the ball in a way that they didn't before. They almost saw it as a moral point about the shot you were playing.
Exactly, and I think what it's also done is it's, even before DRS was formally introduced, when you had the non-official kind of Sky Scope and Hawkeye on Channel 4 and Sky, the existence of it, I actually think gave umpires a bit more confidence to give more LBWs and to say, you know what, that is out. And so you get more LBWs, and I think that the stats are clear on that. And it, as you say, it has also changed the way the game is being played in terms of the finger spinner coming into it and the way that the batsman will play the finger spinner. So I think all those are in keeping with the spirit of the LBW law as it is there, because the spirit of it is, you know what, if you have been, if a spinner has essentially outfoxed you, you know, you've gone for that big cross-batted shot and you missed it. You know, I feel like that's the moral victory, and that's what the spirit of that law is meant to justify. You know, you've been outwitted by the spinner, on your way. So, as I think the LBW, I think DRS is working really well for it. I think with VAR, it's just been completely the opposite way with offside. In that, it's not in keeping with the spirit of how that law has been framed.
There's a massive issue. A massive difference between LBW and offside, which is cricket is a series of discrete moments. So, you know, in theory, 540 balls a day, in Test cricket. But the ball is bowled, the shot is played, and at some point the ball is dead, and then you can stop and you can look at the video and you can start again. And if if the batsman's been given out wrongly, you can overturn that. If he's been given not out wrongly, you can overturn that. The problem we're now finding with offside is linesmen just keep their flags down. Because if they give somebody offside, you can't go back and have the chance again. That attack is dead.
I totally agree.
And so what we're now getting is incredible leniency, and I think they've been told to do it. Incredible leniency from linesmen.
Yeah.
But the huge problem with that is it's not just the forward has a shot, and then you go back and you have a look at it, because the consequences of that shot could be enormous. The ball could be in play for another 90 seconds, another 2 minutes.
Absolutely.
Or it could lead to a corner. A corner, it never gets checked. You never come back and look at it. And so the attacking team's got a corner that it should have been a free kick the other way 20 seconds earlier.
And you're getting, as you say, large kind of ghost moments of up to 90 seconds, 2 minutes, where you think actually before VAR, this would have been flagged offside very, very early, and we just wouldn't have known what would have happened. What you're doing now is the linesman isn't flagging, they're playing on for 90 seconds. If the goal is then scored, they're then going back and checking 90 seconds previously and you're causing so much more controversy.
The records obsessive in me always wonders when the game goes on and then it's called back, and suppose like Sergio Busquets plays like a dream pass, and then the play is called back. Like, what happens to that pass? Like,
those stats are wiped. I've asked Ops about this. Yeah. The stats are wiped, but obviously, if you break your leg in that 2 minutes, your broken leg remains broken.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to know is, what if you get a situation where, I don't know, it's extreme, but one player punches another one.
That's still a red card. I've checked about that as well.
What would happen then?
Punched.
It would be a red card.
So
violent conduct remains violent conduct, even in these ghost periods, as you rather elegantly called it.
Yeah.
So passes are not passes, but injuries are still injuries, and red cards are still red cards.
Okay, can I ask a question of the football people? Because I mean, I watch football, but not as assiduously as you do. Yeah. In DRS, we've got this faintly insane situation, but it seems to kind of work, where you have referrals, and you have a number of referrals at your disposal. Mm-hmm. Now, this may affect the way umpires treat decisions, and that might be something we'll come on to later. If a team has got 2 referrals up their sleeve, an umpire might go, well, it's a marginal call, I'm going to leave it and see if the team's going to refer it. Yeah. And they might actually make a decision differently, I don't know, from if the situation was that the team didn't have those 2 referrals, but the other side had a referral, so they could refer it. Do you think in football, if you actually gave sides a limited number of referrals to VAR, you would improve VAR, it would stay the same, or it would get worse?
Jonathan can give you the expert answer for this, but I would vote strongly in favor of giving Jose Mourinho that responsibility. I really want that.
Okay, the problem with it, I mean, I like in cricket the sort of the almost tactical nature of that, and it sort of stops you kind of, complaining ridiculously, and it does sort of take some of the pressure off umpires in the sense that
we reset, don't we? We reset once those decisions, once the DRS is gone, we weirdly now go into a world with no DRS, which is a bit strange for the viewer.
Yeah, but what I mean is that whereas you used to have, there's a spinner bowling, there's fielders round the bat, there'd be the batsman would hit the pad and it would go to the short leg, and everybody would appeal and there'd be huge appeals. Well, the umpire now knows if they think it's out, if they think it has hit bat and pad, then they'll refer it. If they don't, well, you didn't really think it was out anyway, then did you? So it does take some of that. I mean, dissent is probably too strong a word for what happens in cricket, but it does take some of that aspect out of it, so that the pressure on umpires is slightly reduced, which then I guess theoretically allows them to be clearer-headed to make decisions going forward. Yeah. My problem with football, and it's this with the idea of giving managers referrals, it's exactly the same as what we were saying about the difference between a game that's a series of discrete moments, as cricket is, and a fluid game that's continuous in the way that football is.
No. The referral can only come in once the ball is dead.
But I mean, then you have the problem that could be 3 or 4 minutes of play earlier.
It could be.
I completely agree.
I'm so obsessed with this flow. I don't get it. I mean, I watched a rugby match today where
the flow
advantage goes on for ages and ages and ages.
It does, but I've come to the conclusion with football that it is enormously difficult to do things that work in other sports because there are just no natural stoppages. And I feel like there are more natural stoppages even in rugby. And whatever you do, it's just the challenge of getting something to work in football with all of these things is how you deal with the flow of the game.
I'm just absolutely in favor of this idea for completely bad reasons, because I want to see just how far people are prepared to go in questioning Jose Mourinho's motives if he ever gets referrals. But all the stuff.
Go quite a long way.
I think the argument in favour of I really like the referral system in cricket. I think if you can make it, I don't think you can make it work in football. If you could, I think it would be brilliant. The reason I really like the referral system in cricket is because it comes down again to like, a democratic idea, which is, do you want process legitimacy or outcome legitimacy? Now, you kind of want both. You want to get your outcomes right. But what you find is that in democratic societies, the thing people like about living in them is that even when the decision goes against you, you feel you've had due process. You feel you've had a fair chance to kind of have your case heard. And what I found fascinating, I found this really came into really stark relief in the Headingley test in the summer, where Ben Stokes obviously was not given out on that ball against Nathan Lyon, and Australia had burnt their reviews, so they couldn't review it. Now, what was fascinating is I think if that had been 20 years ago, the umpire would have got all the grief. The umpire would have been absolutely slaughtered in the press.
Absolutely.
What was fascinating is the umpire, I mean, he got a bit of criticism, but all the Australians turned on Tim Payne. And they turned on Tim Payne because he had the reviews. He'd had the opportunity, and he burnt those reviews. And what it made me realise is people don't just want the right decision, they want autonomy. And the point is that what
they want to take back control, Daisy. They want to take back control.
But what the referral system gives the captain and the players is a feeling of autonomy, that you are not just going to get absolutely sawn off on a rotten decision. But if you burnt your reviews, well, tough. You had your chance, and actually the system isn't there. It shouldn't be there for tactical reasons. It should be there to overturn the howler. If you use it frivolously, well, then you deserve to have a howler almost. And what I found fascinating was that a lot of Australian fans and pundits just automatically bought into that and turned on Tim Payne rather than Joel Wilson. So I think the referral system is really powerful. And if you could make it work in football, I think it would be fantastic. I don't think you can make it work, or at least I think it would be very difficult for all the reasons that John said. You would see, and who would have the review? In cricket, it's very easy to say, well, the fielding captain or the batsman takes a review. What would you do? Who would have the review in football? Do you give it to, do you have a 15-second, in cricket, you have a 15-second window that makes sense. So to go back to my natural stoppages point, well, what would you do in football? You can't have 15 seconds where the striker, the manager and the captain all come together to have a discussion because the play's going on.
Wait till the ball goes out of play. And once the ball goes out of play, then you've got 15 seconds. And in football, I mean, it does go out of play quite a lot. There's quite a few.
Right.
If a team had broken and scored a goal, the team would then always frivolously review anything that happened up to it.
I think there's a basic distinction between football and cricket in that the appeal has no legal role in football, whereas in cricket it does, right? I mean, you can only be given if you appeal, right? And so I'm actually just to go back to something Daniel was saying earlier about umpires keeping in mind how many reviews people have left and making decisions on that basis. I mean, Joel Wilson famously did not do that, right? He just gave it as he saw it. And I thought, I did a whole thread on this, on the Joel Wilson decision. And I thought, based on what he saw and based on, the way Stokes lost his balance and, he fell over to the offside and his front foot sort of slid away outside like stump. I thought it was perfectly reasonable in real time for Joel Wilson to think that, well, that's not straightening. And it hit both pads and it was not clear. So that, I mean, if you wanted to sort of make a good faith attempt to explain, well, the umpire gave this decision and why might he have given this decision, then there was a lot of material there to sort of explain this.
I agree with you. I think it was a perfectly reasonable on-field decision. Australia had burnt their reviews. Right,
but it brings up this whole thing, right? DRS is a whole separate method of assessment, right? It's a whole... It operates at a different level of precision with a different degree of systematicity, if that's a word. I think it is. And whereas umpiring has its own gestalt, for want of a better word, we've sort of shoehorned these two things together, I think mainly because of the pressure of television. And, this conversation seems to suggest that, DRS is really doing well and these VAR is doing badly. I'm not convinced that that's entirely the case.
I think you're right about it being shoehorned together. I know what you mean. It does feel very cobbled together. But the weird thing is, I feel it's cobbled together and it's kind of working. That even the things we didn't anticipate it, for me, haven't worked out too badly. And again, I'm probably biased because it is doing so badly in football. But the other thing I like about it is I watch a lot of cricket live and on TV. And I think both live and on TV, it works for the fans. Whereas, I watch a lot of football live and in the ground. And in the ground, the experience for the fan is appalling. So I do kind of look at how it's
Why is that? Is that because they don't tell you anything?
You're never aware. I can never work out when the review is happening. Whereas in cricket, I really like the fact that the fielding team will do the T shape, or the reviewer will do the T shape with their hands, and then the umpire will do a square. And there's no similar thing in football. And that for me is where I say you can say things you like about it being difficult in football, natural stoppages, so on and so forth. But that for me is just negligence. You have to find a simple way of letting the fans in the ground know what's happening. And also in cricket at home, you can hear the deliberations of the umpires, and there's a transparency and a kind of a protocol to it. And I'm really fascinated to hear John saying that the FA won't release the guidance to referees, because again, you feel another part of the important process legitimacy, whether or not you get to the right outcome, is we can all feel that a process has been followed, that there's a transparency about that there's a protocol. And sure, if it comes out and maybe we're still thinking this was a 50-50 call, we can think, well, but I saw how we arrived at it. The issue you have with football is it's not clear, I feel, to whether you're in the ground or at home, what is going on. In cricket,
I agree with that completely, Daisy. And I mean, Jonathan's best place to describe this. But in cricket, our third umpire and TV review umpires are all at the ground. Everything is there. I mean, the fact that there is this sort of nameless group of weirdos deep in a windowless dungeon, all in exactly the same place, conducting these VARs on every game, is really weird with football. And football's desire to be opaque has always fascinated me. Whenever I listen to phone-ins, whenever I listen to fans talking about football, there's always an attempt to obfuscate so that you come out of it none the wiser. Because notions of intent, for example, are insane. And maybe, I mean, I just put this out there, and I don't know if there's any hope in this at all, but might VAR actually be a very painful process for football pundits and fans and players to have to face the reality that they need to actually get a little bit more binary and black and white on their sport, or just spend the rest of their lives shouting at each other into a giant hole in which no one's going to come out any the wiser.
The problem with it is that the football is not binary. With the DRS, whether you're in the ground or watching on telly, and whether you've got an earpiece in at the ground or whether you're just watching it on the screen, we know that. I mean, I guess the first couple of seasons maybe we didn't, but we're very confident in the series of steps you go through to judge an LBW. So we know that first of all they'll check the front foot no ball, then we know that they'll check whether there's been any contact on the bat, and then we know that the stages of where it pitches, where it strikes the batsman, and then whether it's hitting the stumps. And so you go through that, and it turns red in the first step and everybody cheers, and it turns red in the second step and everybody cheers, and then it's going just over. But in football, you don't have that series of very the decisions are. It's not easy to impose a protocol on it because
that's what I mean.
You're looking at.
I mean, do the laws of football or rules? I forget what you call them.
Laws.
Rules. But
laws.
Might they actually? Because I mean, look, one really obvious one is one that you talked to me about with offside. There's obviously going to be a defender's body movement is going to be moving forward and away from this line that you create for offside, and an attacker's is going to be moving forward and over. So if the armpit can count as offside, is that actually just a failure in the writing of the rules? If you just said nothing more than feet, just change the bloody law.
But you get into all kinds of bother with that as well, because it turns out what we think of as being offside, what we've naturally been judging without realising it all these years, is torso, is what we've been. Yeah. You can see something that's technically onside by because of where the toes are, and it still looks wrong.
Yeah.
And it's actually I think that's and it's a problem that you've got trying to create a set of laws that works for VAR, bearing in mind most football is played without VAR. So even from the Championship down, you don't have VAR. So Arsene Wenger came up with this idea last week, where he said, well, maybe we try and reintroduce the spirit of levelness, which now doesn't exist because it's level to a pixel rather than a chunk of human. And if part of you is onside, then you are onside, rather than part of you being offside, then you're offside. But the problem with that, initially I thought, that does solve this level issue, because it just shifted where the line that we're going to argue over is, and suddenly level is back to being onside. But then you actually look at how a linesman in practice would try and adjudicate that. And the way offside works at the minute is, for linesmen, they try to keep in line with that penultimate defender. So they try to keep their eyes level with the back part of that penultimate defender. And then when a pass is played, they can see if anybody's gone beyond that line. And that is, I'm not saying it's easy to do, but it's a relatively understandable process. Whereas if you're looking there, rather at the back part of the furthest forward, that could be in a crowded box. You could have 10 players in your way. And that makes it impossible to adjudicate without TV, and possibly impossible to adjudicate with TV. So in practice, it just does not work for leagues without VAR. And I think you have to, as far as possible, keep the laws of the game the same for everybody. So,
I don't think you can have that. If you have different forensic instruments examining the action, then you're going to have different sets of rules, because different instruments have different degrees of precision at which they operate.
Clearly that is true, but equally you'd be making a massive difference between the Premier League and the Championship.
That's true.
Of what could be realistically given by the human eye. That something that's will be given offside in the Championship is actually 5 feet onside in the Premier League.
Exactly.
And that doesn't work at all. That's insanity.
John, to go back to the earlier point, that the fact is that, as John made clear, that really delicate changes in interpretation of the offside law have really changed the way the game is played. So, tweaks in 2005, you can make an argument, enabled Barcelona and Spain's passing football of the following decade. So the problem you've got here is that tweaks in the way this is interpreted really can make a really big difference. And for me, having thought about it, I think the challenge you've got, and why the Wenger sort of thing that won't work either, is you've got that both lines are so fluid. In cricket, when you've got your line call, when you've got your batsman grounding his bat, you can have really close calls. But you kind of feel like, well, look, it's a line that is literally a line, and it's the same in football with is the ball over the line or not?
With goal line technology, goal line technology works because the line is fixed. Exactly.
The problem you've got with the offside rule is both lines are fluid.
Are moving. Yeah.
Both lines are moving.
Well, both lines are moving, and the moment at which the ball is played is not constant.
Exactly.
You've got three kind of.
John, I know that back in the day there was an experiment, wasn't there, in the sort of 20s, to have a rule that they painted a line on the 40-yard line and effectively said that's your offside line. It's fixed. Now that would make one line fixed. Obviously, the moment the ball leaves the boot.
Well, the line they painted in the 20s when they were looking at changing the offside law in 1925. Yeah. They painted the line. I think it was 40 yards or maybe 35 yards from goal. Yeah. And basically, they just said you can only be offside if you're beyond that. So you'd still have the two.
You still have it,
the two lines. And I think in the US in the 70s, I think they experimented with having that rather than you can only be offside in the opponent's half, you could only be offside if you were within 35 or 40 yards of the opponent's goal. It would discourage the high press because you would then have forwards hanging around sort of between the halfway line and that 40-yard line.
Which is exactly what I mean, that subtle changes to this have a major impact on
I think
the game.
The offside law is hugely important. It's sort of like a valve that you can you can compress or decompress the game by fiddling with that valve. And it felt like we got it in I think those 2005 changes, I think we got it just about in the right place. It felt that creative attacking football was being encouraged, but not to a ludicrous degree. And that's now been this very, very fine balance we spent a long time getting to. We've kind of tossed out the window to solve another issue.
what is that other issue you think that we are solving? Because in cricket, it was very clear what we were trying to solve, which was that cricket was a nationalist game, really. I mean, just played really at the highest level, which is where DRS is, by competing countries. And we were getting to a point where it was the conversation was becoming unpleasant, that umpires were getting outrageously blamed for losses by one country or another, and those countries then became inflamed with furious rage. So in a way, I mean, DRS, I think, has done fantastic things at taking that aspect out of post-game analysis and punditry and defusing that really puerile nonsense. What was VAR introduced to do in football?
I
exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
exactly. The tribalism of football. It doesn't have to be countries to be tribal.
Yeah.
You know, it's tribal with clubs.
I do sympathise with the thing you said earlier, Dan. You know, I don't want to glorify the past. You want to get rid of the howlers. You want to get rid. Everyone said this in cricket, and it's the same in football. You want to get rid of those decisions where literally 20 seconds later, everyone at home who's seen a replay knows that was the wrong decision. And you know, the question is, how many of those were there really ever? And I think there were some. I remember, you know, just on offside last season, West Ham's home game against Liverpool, we drew 1-1. Liverpool's goal, I think James Milner was like, you know, a long way offside, and it was apparent almost immediately that was a big howler. So, you know, there are errors that will be made with offside.
Is the world a better or worse place for the hand of God?
Right, and the hand of God, I was literally going to say that. You know, those, when you think of those howlers, you think of those moments where literally 20 seconds later, everybody in the world can see that that's a handball. The really big question, which I don't think any sport has solved perfectly, including cricket, is how do you get to a place where you eliminate the howler without introducing all kinds of other issues and complications and problems? And look, you know, the reason I got interested in this, not the reason I got interested, but I work in assessment where you're grading children's essays. And it's the challenge there that, yes, some do get the wrong mark, but no system has ever been found that will get 100% of essays to the right mark. And you do get into an issue of what is the right mark. And that's what I find very interesting is in lots of other areas of measurement in life, you've got exactly the same issue. You probably got to a point with cricket and football and with marking essays where you probably are getting, you know, maybe 85, 90% of judgments right. Yeah. In order to get it any higher than that, you start trading off on other things you care about. So maybe you can go from 90% of decisions right to 95%, but in order to do so, you've traded off a whole load of stuff about the offside rule that is now, you know, completely changing the way the game is played. Do you want that trade-off? So for me, I think it does come down to the fact to improve any of the accuracy, you're trading off other things, and we can't pretend that eliminating the howler is cost-free, I guess. It's interesting to listen to you guys, because when I was imagining this podcast, I thought that, you know, most of the difficult issues that would come up would be to do with judgment calls, you know, like red cards and penalties and whatnot and fouls. But, you know, it is the question of fact, which seems to create a lot of anxiety. I wanted to ask Jonathan about the Klopp's proposal. Jurgen Klopp has this idea of making the line thick, which would effectively, in a strict formal sense, do for offside what umpire's call does for LBW in cricket, which is that it will create sort of a buffer which, you know, which by design grants the benefit of the doubt to one or the other party.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously always going to have a point where the line is.
Yeah.
And no matter how thick you make the line, the line's then got a front and a back, which I guess means it isn't technically a line. But
so it's a band.
One of the problems I have, and I guess to an extent it's an issue of vocabulary, but when you hear a load of people saying, well, you got umpires call in cricket, why can't you just have that in football? And there's two reasons why you can't have it, which is umpires call in cricket, apart from the very strange instance of where the ball strikes the batsman, which I think you should not have umpires call for, because you know where it's happened. You can, you know, you have a fixed camera there looking at it. And
Yes and
within
no.
a certain margin of error, it has happened. Where umpire's call, I think, is a useful thing, is in its predictive element. But in football, it's not predictive. You're judging something that, okay, is incredibly difficult to measure because you have 3 moving parts, or in some cases more than 3 moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
But it is something that has happened. It is a fact, and you do have footage of that. So what would, and I don't know how possible this is, but what would feel right to me, and I guess you'd probably have to do a series of tests to find out what this measurement is. But when I was going through the maths earlier, I'm not going to go through the maths again. We said that essentially between one frame of film and next frame, you can have relative movement of around about 30 centimeters. That's quite normal and quite common. Now, obviously, players are not always moving at 25 kph. Sometimes they're moving a bit faster. More often than not, they're moving a bit slower. So you work out what a sort of a reasonable margin of error to introduce is, and you say, well, actually, we can't judge this to within closer than 12 centimeters, or whatever distance that happens to be, and you make the line you draw that thick. But also, you can't have the umpire's call equivalent of a linesman flags if he thinks it's off, or if he thinks it's not, or doesn't flag if he thinks it's not off. Because if he flags and he thinks it's off and it's not off, well,
absolutely.
you've killed an attack and you can't sort of
Absolutely.
recreate that attack.
Yeah.
Unless you're saying they should go ahead and play out the attack
In
with
which
him
case,
standing over this flag up,
ruining
and
the
then you
umpire's
go back
call
and check it
principle.
as if he's given
Yeah.
it. But that then creates
Exactly.
another ghost period of play, which
Absolutely.
seems really weird.
Yeah.
Actually, the impact is actually the part of ball tracking which is technically the hardest thing to do. Because what you're trying to do there is you're trying to look for when the ball hits the pad, and the pad could be on the move, or the pad could be planted, or the leg or the foot could be planted.
Right, and I guess you have the same issue of the frame rates. You have a gap between.
Yeah. So there are sort of two systems. One is a system where they have an operator who actually picks the frame where the impact is deemed to have occurred, and then the prediction is based on that entry. And the other is a system where the algorithm will give you a choice of frames, and you pick from that one, or there's some semi-automated method of picking from that one. So in that sense, I think especially when it's sort of marginal on off stump and on leg stump, the umpire's call for impact is actually a good idea.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but I mean, I guess that's it's the same principle that we're saying, that you can't be in football. You can't be absolutely certain when the pass is played, and you can't be absolutely certain between frames, as to when the key moment has occurred. So it's exactly the same problem as football.
If you wanted the really high-tech solution, I have no idea if this would work or not, but I know they've experimented in rugby with a little bit of this, but you would coat all the players and the ball with sensors. And then you would have a buzzer that would go off immediately.
Would they agree?
Daisy, I've been a massive fan of this forever. I think that every footballer's boot should actually say their own name in their own voice when they come into contact with the ball. So that way you'd know who got to the ball first. So Ryan for Ryan Giggs. And this would just play out really loudly, constantly.
Yeah.
And that way there would never be any doubt whatsoever whether if he played the ball or he played the man.
But you do have a problem with boots for offside. So what you'd actually have to do is, as soon as a player gets a Premier League contract, which is huge, so they should make some sacrifice, that you implant a chip probably into their pelvis, and you say, right, we're judging offsides based on that chip in your pelvis.
Why did you choose the pelvis?
Well, you've seen my pelvis. You know how attractive it is.
It's beautiful, but in normal sci-fi, it's just put in just behind the left ear.
I guess I'm thinking of when you look at a frozen frame to judge an offside.
Right.
Where feels the most corporeal part of the player? Where's the bit that's least likely to be sort of floating off away from the main part of the body?
I think you need sensors all over them, and then an immediate. So you'd get rid of all this photo finish stuff. You'd have a buzzer immediately, and the buzzer would immediately come up on the screen so all the fans could see it too. Yeah.
I think the press gallery should vote.
Or there'll be a lot of decisions going West Ham's way then.
Well, this does actually raise some interesting questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the future of technology is that it's going to get. I don't know whether we'll call it better, but it's going to be different, isn't it?
Yes.
And so we've just started with VAR and DRS.
Mm-hmm.
So we can ask questions about whether VAR will materially change the laws of football, about whether DRS will change the laws of cricket or just simply the application of the laws by the standing umpires. But also, I suppose, as technology improves, where does this ultimately take us? I mean, can we imagine, and is it desirable, a future really without arbiters, but just with technology?
Well, that's one of the things in wider kind of legal discussions. People talk about that. So a lot of Carter, you'll know more about this than me, but a lot of modern buildings, for example, are built with kind of sensors where the temperature, can't drop below or go above a certain legal limit.
Right.
And a large move in a lot of law and a lot of professions is to come up with ways where you're almost taking the human out of the judgment, and you are putting in kind of automated systems, and it's the system designer who is responsible for those. So in some ways, sport is very much behind the times in that it's using technology, but it's kind of using technology in a really kind of 1980s way, if you like. It isn't using it's just getting video replays for humans to look at in lots of cases. You're right. The big step forward would be automated decisions, like the one I'm suggesting about coating players in sensors.
Would that be desirable though, Daisy?
I'm not sure it is. I'm not sure it is. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but.
Well, I genuinely don't know, because I've seen the impact that neutral umpires has made on the discourse of cricket, and just how vital that's been to get rid of a perceived resentment from one country to the other. Yeah. And yet at the same time, one of the things we absolutely adore about sport is the arbitrary nature of its arbitration, isn't it?
Well, I think you still have. I mean, if I talk about, I think the kind of the arbitrary things that will always remain, whatever you do with technology, will be just the really fine margins where, yes, it was the right decision. His bat was just out, so he's out. But you just ponder on the fineness of that margin. And there's one I always remember, which was I was at the match actually, so I wasn't seeing the replays on the screen. But 2009. I think Marcus North was it was the last day of the Ashes at the Oval, 2009. I think Marcus North was stumped. I think there was a punting run out from Flintoff and a Marcus North stumping, and they were both incredibly fine margins. But you would both in both cases say, it was the right decision was reached. So you'll never lose that. You'll never lose the fact of, oh my goodness, the whole match hanging on a millimetre. But you're right. Do we want something where you are completely losing that human element? I don't know. I mean, I write more widely about technology and the impact of technology on society. And one thing I will say is that things that one generation tend to find unthinkable and unspeakable, kind of 10 years later are the norm. There's all kinds of examples of, we let technology do things now, which 30 years ago people would have thought crazy, which now we think crazy if you didn't let them do it. So these things tend to kind of, norms change.
AI in time will become good enough that you can sort of show, I mean, I'm going to expose my hideous ignorance how this works, but you can sort of feed kind of the video of a million football matches into this sort of computer. And you can say, this is what is a foul, this is what is not. It's all that crude knowledge. Becomes this sort of AI something. And then the really clever bit, you can then show it only games refereed by, say, Mike Dean. And so you have your panel of 20 or 25 referees, whatever it is for the season, but they each have a personality of a great ref of the past.
So we haven't thought about that, but the organisation I work for, No More Marking, we use a technique called comparative judgment. And comparative judgment is a way of kind of making decisions about things like penalties, things where maybe there's not necessarily binary, but they're on a distribution. And we
Yeah.
thought about the idea of using it. And the nice thing about it is it wouldn't actually be, the first step wouldn't be AI. The first step would be human judgment, but it would be mass distributed human judgment. So the idea would be that you could take, a couple of 100,000 videos of penalty decisions, scrub all the names and the shirts of the players, and you could get a bunch of fans, again, thousands of fans, to do comparative judgment of all of those penalty decisions. You could then essentially have a measurement scale for every penalty decision where, the highest score would be something that's essentially a stone cold penalty, and the lowest score would be something that was never a penalty. And then you'd have all the shades in between of those where you are literally saying that is really 50-50. People just could not decide. And then the first step would be, well, that would be a really useful training bank, because that would be something that you could, and quite transparent as well. You could say, look, here is what a bunch of fans, you could just do it with referees, expert referees, but here is what, we have said, we have got some kind of definitive numbers we can put on some of these decisions. The really tricky thing would be then applying that to a live match. And that's where I think you would need the AI. You couldn't have fans, judging it in real time, because bias would come in. So what you then need is a way of clipping, the 15 seconds of the actual decision you want to make a decision on, and comparing it to your bank of hundreds of thousands of decisions and saying which one does it most closely correspond to. You'd have to have some form of AI for that.
I'm beginning to imagine now the problem shifting to a debate between which model produces the best sigmoid curve to make a continuous distribution of from absolutely stone cold penalty to absolutely no penalty, as many of the ones in the middle as possible, to clearly separate them. That's where the problem will shift, because then it will be an argument between models, and there will always be sort of a large number of marginal cases where in some models they would go one way and in another model they would go another way.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And you could argue that's the same at the minute in terms of, whether you get Mike Dean or you get Michael Oliver, you're getting a different system. But, I mean, look, I'm saying all these things, and I find it really fun to play around with ideas of comparative judgment of penalty decisions and, censor offside rules. There is a very strong argument to say, let's just move back and take VAR out of it altogether. Because, this is the point I was kind of making in my tweet as well. The minute you start to go down these rabbit holes, you get into a position where you realise it is a sport. Do we really want to do this? And maybe we do, but I'm not saying we definitely do.
The other interesting impact of VAR, which I don't think we've fully seen yet, is what impact it has on player behaviour. Irrespective of decisions, do players behave better because they think they're being watched? And I'll give you an example of this where we definitely know it changed behaviour. And that was when they first introduced the referees behind the goals. So that rather than having referee, two linesmen, the fourth official, you had referee, two linesmen, fourth official, plus the two officials behind the goals. Now, they tend to be sneered at because they don't visibly make a decision. They press the button on their sensor and it buzzes on the referee's wrist, and he knows that, and they then communicate with him through the headset. So they never are seen to give or not give a decision. But they were introduced at Euro 2008, and what you saw was suddenly a spike in goals scored from headers from corners because defenders weren't holding forward because they felt they were being watched.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of untold aspect of VAR, which I don't really think we'll get to grips with for maybe a season or two, as to does it make players behave better? And if it does make players behave better, then maybe it's all worth it. And I mean, something that may be coincidence and maybe aren't other factors, but offsides this season are at an all-time low. I think we're down to 3.6 per game, whereas 10 years ago we were at about 5.5. Now, again, that might be because linesmen just aren't putting their flags up because they know the consequence of giving an offside that's not offside is far greater than not giving an offside that is offside. But it is changing sort of background issues in the game. And if there's fewer offsides, that I think most people would generally agree is a positive result.
DRS has definitely improved on-field behaviour towards umpires, I would say.
Has it? It has legitimized bad behaviour. I mean, basically, players used to question umpires, and it used to be futile, and it used to be called dissent. And now they can officially do it. Like, 2 times per game. I mean, so we just changed the definition of what constitutes good and bad behavior.
Well,
We've changed the terms of the argument.
I get exactly what you're saying there, Carters, but the difference between Mike Gatty poking his finger at Shakur Rana.
Yeah, but that's Shakur Rana. That's a crazy umpire, right?
I'm with Dan on this. I feel like particularly in those matches, 5-day pitches, wearing track, bat pads, where frankly the umpire's job is so fiendish. Yeah. I feel like Shane Warne would just go out and appeal every ball, and really that Australian team would try and really intimidate the umpire. It's much harder to do that now, and you see it because you get those decisions where the umpire will shake his head, and the team's vociferously appealed, and then they don't review it, and suddenly everyone's looking and laughing. And saying, well, hang on a minute, you were jumping around saying this was out a minute ago. You clearly don't think it's that out because you're not reviewing. And so I think it has changed that dynamic for the better.
Well, and it's also
Wait a minute. Just in the 1950s, was it, or 60s, the England team actually kidnapped a Pakistan umpire off the close of play. I mean, I would say that's pretty disgraceful behaviour. And
true.
You don't get much. Was it Baig? Was his name?
This is why, Daniel. This is why the hand of God is the greatest decision in the history of sports. and Maradona's description of it, whether it's true or apocryphal, is just like the single greatest statement ever made by any human ever.
Well, there's no question he said it. A little bit the hand of Maradona, a little bit the hand of God.
Yeah, a little bit the head of Maradona, a little bit the hand of God. It's the perfect description. No.
I think actually there's another point here about DRS and the referral system is, firstly, it sort of acknowledges that perfection is impossible. So you're saying, look, the umpire's allowed to make mistakes. It's insane to expect infallibility, and it's also making players do some umpiring. They have to make the wicketkeeper or the bowler or whoever has to make the judgment of, was that out? And what we've seen from DRS referrals is that the vast majority of appeals are wrong.
Absolutely.
It's roughly a third, 2/3. The third are overturned.
3/4.
Three quarters.
Yeah, 3/4 fail. 3/4 of the player referrals fail.
And now, obviously, some of those will be very speculative towards the end of innings, or speculative, when the new ball's due and you're about to get another set of referrals.
Not anymore. But still, not anymore.
Yeah, the number 6 and number 7 batsmen do a lot of referring, which ends up badly.
Yep.
Yeah. But this is it. It's my point about autonomy. And you're absolutely right. It forces the players to take more responsibility. And then you realise, actually, umpiring is really hard. And I would say, just from my perspective, it's made me feel that actually it makes you realise more just how many decisions they get right and just how many of the things you think are howlers are really not. And so I would say, just as a general kind of principle, that I really like the referral system. I think it's really well done.
That India referral against Australia in the opening game of the Women's T20, that was such a bad review. Honestly, have docked them all reviews for the rest of the tournament. 6 inches outside leg stump was a nonsense.
If a player reviews something which they're not sure about, then the penalty for doing that should be higher than the penalty for making just a dumb mistake.
Right, but that's hard
because they're introducing the umpire.
That's hard to put in. I mean, I feel the fact that you only have a couple of reviews, you do get punished if you use them frivolously. And we've seen enough teams get punished, like, Tim Payne, Nathan Lyon. If you use it frivolously, you will get punished. So I think like I said, I like the fact that it gives the players that autonomy, that responsibility. It shows you that they're not better than the umpires. Umpiring is hard. If it were so easy, how come the players weren't getting them all right? So for me, I think the structure of it works really well and takes the pressure off the umpire and probably does improve some of the player behaviour too. And as with any system, obviously there's attempts to game it and to play it. Yeah. But for me, on balance, I like it. I think it works. And I think, it's rare for us to praise cricketing authorities. But I have to say, after the shambles of VAR and of the way I think that the fans are just taken for granted, it does make me respect a little bit more the system you have in cricket and the way the fans, it works for them as well.
Can I just ask one? I don't know whether this is a ludicrously Sudish question, but I've got a couple of, veterans of Sood's Corner on Private Eye, so they'll be able to help me out on this. Is it that sport is the last remaining place where people can feel absolutely certain about something? A transgression or not, it's out or not, it's offside or not, it's a foul or not. And this allows us a sense of outrage when it's not done right that is particularly comforting at the moment. People seem to love being outraged.
I think that's a good question, because I was actually going to put that question in another way, because I think you're getting at this question of the authority figure, because the referee and the umpire in the late 19th century were sort of one of the first secular judges, who were trusted and whose decisions were accepted, and so on and so forth, right? And in fiction, you have the whole figure of the detective who comes in, who's not really performing deductions, but is always presented as a morally secure figure who's always going to try to do right and always does right in the end. Poirot does that, and Marple does that, and Morse does that, and Sherlock Holmes did that, and Dupin did that, and all of them did that. And now what seems to have happened is that with video, the enhanced scrutiny of video and the enhanced sort of complexity which it has revealed about decisions and information and judgment seems to have, firstly, it seems to have put so much pressure on authority that the video has to come into the tent and try to help them out, try to help the referees out, try to help the umpires out. And in the process, it seems to sort of have reduced them to being clerks, in a sense. Umpires are now basically, the third umpire exercises almost no judgment. I could do a third umpire's job, and anybody could do the third umpire's job, because all the procedure is laid out in excruciating detail.
The comparison with detectives sort of and technology works there as well. Because one of the problems that modern detective story has is DNA and forensic medicine.
Correct.
And to an extent, the detective becomes a sort of the clerk who administrates what he's being told by the pathologist.
Yeah, it's no surprise that the great ages of detective fiction and the great ages of cricket, the golden age of cricket, overlap. No, I totally agree, and I think it's not just detective novels. It's law. You look at sentencing guidelines or parole board decisions. One of the most famous studies into human decision making is all about parole board officers making inconsistent decisions depending on how close it is to lunch or not. And there's the whole bunch of these decisions that shows human judgment is very inconsistent. And if you can, the more you scrutinise it with technology, the more that becomes apparent. And in the situations where you can replace human judgment with an algorithm, there's sort of the landmark work on this, clinical versus statistical prediction by Paul Meehl. Statistical prediction will outdo you every single time. And the fact is that's when you're on the receiving end of the bad human decision, you can feel very smug about that. When you yourself are the human, it's much worse. And I think what we're seeing is more and more decisions in the world are being outsourced to algorithms. And whilst that might give us a consistency, there is that worry of, well, what are humans for anymore? What do humans do anymore? Your judges, your detectives, your referees, your umpires, if everything is being outsourced somewhere. And as I say, in that sense, actually, sport hasn't gone as far down that road, because sport, as I say, is not using algorithms largely. It's not using automated systems. It's just using replays for another set of humans to look at. But I think you're right in that the beginning of this trend within sport, it probably is quite unsettling. And it is a sign of, I think, wider issues, as I said, about technology and society. As to, who do we want making the decisions? What's more important, a right outcome or a right process? What's more important, the right process or a transparent process? The other issue people have with algorithms making decisions is a lot of the time they're not transparent, particularly machine learning ones. It's very hard for us to know exactly how a decision was arrived at. So I absolutely think it plays into all those wider issues about what are humans for in a world of computers.
I want to conclude by putting Daniel's question in to all three of you in this way, which is that given that the nature of evidence and the nature of the complexity of information and the difficulty of reaching judgment is being made evident to mass viewership through sport, is there a case for saying that sport as an aspect of life which ultimately does not matter and is a closed, internally consistent system in and of itself? Is there a case to be made for keeping it in a way which preserves the authority figure? Or do you think, is there I guess I'm asking, where do you stand on modernity? But, so I think, Daisy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so for me, I know, I think that is interesting. And as I say, I am sort of genuinely torn on this. On the one hand, part of me finds it really fascinating to debate ways you could, put sensors on the ball and on the players and, comparatively judge banks of penalty decisions and use AI to come up with decisions in real time. Another part of me thinks, why do we want to do that? Like, if it is just getting you a couple of % more decisions, what are you trading off? What are you losing? Right. I suppose for me, the halfway house would be, I would like to see kind of research and experiments with some of these more advanced ways of doing things. What I feel is the worst situation we've got into at the minute with football is we've got into a situation where we kind of got the worst of both worlds. We haven't really improved the correct decisions, and we've sacrificed and traded off a lot of valuable things for that. So for me, if you are going to trade off the authority figure and some of the things about the flow of the game and the way it just works at the moment, you have to be pretty certain that you're going to trade off that for some benefits. And at the minute, I just don't feel those benefits are there.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem the football's got is it just didn't trial this properly. Yeah. You need to trial it properly, not just over one season. You could trial over one season and one league, but you need to do proper trials to see what issues come up. And what all seems to have happened is there doesn't seem to be any dialogue whatsoever between different leagues. So, Germany, Australia, the US, Italy all had VAR before the Premier League. And yet none of those lessons seem to have been learned. We seem to be repeating the same errors and not finding any solutions to them. So, I personally think DRS has been a huge improvement for cricket, although there was a wobbly period while we sort of got used to it. But I now think it's part of the game and a beneficial part of the game. And my issue with VAR in football, and I remember this was about 10 years, 15 years I was giving the same answer. VAR I'm in favour of in theory. I haven't yet seen a form of it in practice that works, and I still haven't. And I just sort of feel that we're sort of looking for patches for the problem. We're looking to sort of tape it up, and nobody's sort of prepared to go back and say, look, this has been disastrous. Let's start again. Let's trial this properly, and let's work out what the best way to do this is. And if that means we go away for 3 or 4 years, and I don't know, some Dutch amateur league has it inflicted upon them while we all learn from that, well, so be it. Rather that than the Premier League, the Champions League, Serie A, or whatever. Yeah. So it just feels to me at the minute it's a very immature system, and it's its immaturity which is creating a lot of issues.
Daniel?
I agree with, annoyingly, everything that Daisy and Jonathan just said there. But I would add to that my attitude to modernity is that technology is always going to improve, and we're always going to use it in sport. People used to do dead heats in 100-meter races when stopwatches weren't good enough to be able to do hundredths of a second.
Right.
Motor racing drives now go to thousandths of seconds. The technology is going to be there the whole time. And until I worked in sport, I didn't really also care about the other component as much as I do now, which is the players themselves. And in cricket, perhaps, it's that much. Why DRS is so good is that it's that much more capricious in existence.
Yes.
While you hear footballers whining about how they might lose their £100,000 a week managerial job, because of a decision that means that their team gets relegated. No one's going to shed too many tears about that. But a young man making his way in a game of cricket who's sawn off really badly by umpires in the first few games they play, it can massively make a difference to their whole life and their whole career. So I do, and if you can see that visibly and it's really obvious that someone's been given a really bad decision, then you sort of, you feel badly for them. You start to empathise for them. So you want the right decisions to be made for a whole variety of different reasons. One of them is empathy with the player, and one of them is so that we just don't have really boring conversations on phone-ins on the radio and TV, which do drive me insane with rage about refereeing decisions and umpiring decisions, because then we're not actually talking about sport at all. We're talking about the guy who's got an incredibly difficult job to do. So my view is that technology will always be there. We will just improve it. I think Jonathan's absolutely right that football has handled VAR really badly, almost as a panic measure, when it's seen rugby handle it so well and cricket handle it so well, and other sports are constantly using technology. And that's really the reason why we're probably arguing about, whether technology is good in sport. For the most part, it is. And I also really like the additional function of referrals, because I just think, and tennis does that too. Yes. Is that, because then you're basically saying to some Mardy athletes, well, put your money where your mouth is. So, I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you all. This has been wonderful. I hope it's given listeners some sense of how to think about it without sort of getting stuck in the weeds of, individual decisions and individual margin calls. So thank you, Daisy, Jonathan, and Daniel. This has been a lot of fun. I'm going to try to think up other pretexts to invite you guys over to talk about other things.
Brilliant.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.